Wow, this is really something else you brought to the table this time.
Oh,
A
yeah.
whole month
Yeah.
worth of human rights violations against Shia Muslims,
It's a lot.
compiled by Shia Rights Watch.
Yeah.
This February 2025 report.
Yeah.
It's intense.
It is. And you know what makes Shia Rights Watch's work so impactful is their approach. They're not just, they're not just shouting from the rooftops. They're meticulously documenting these incidents, uh, pulling from both private sources and public reports. It
Hmm.
really lends credibility to their findings.
Yeah, and it covers a huge geographical area too.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at incidents from Afghanistan and Pakistan all the way to Bahrain and Lebanon, even Syria, Saudi Arabia and Iraq.
Grr.
It's a global picture of what Shia communities are facing.
Exactly. And what's striking is the sheer variety of violations. It's not just one type of oppression. We're
Right.
seeing everything from forced conversions and bombings to assassinations, executions, and even the destruction of homes and mosques.
Yeah.
It paints a very disturbing picture of systematic and targeted persecution.
Okay, let's dive into the specifics.
Okay.
The report starts with Afghanistan.
Uh-huh.
And right off the bat, we're hit with these forced conversions in Badakhshan province.
Yeah.
It's almost unbelievable. The Taliban is forcing entire Shia families,
I know.
even children, to convert to Sunni Islam.
This isn't just a violation of religious freedom. It's a deliberate attempt to erase an entire cultural and religious identity.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about the Taliban's ideology and their iron grip on the region.
And then it's like whiplash, because the report takes us to Kunduz, where a bank bombing
Right.
killed and injured dozens of people.
Yeah, the Kunduz bombing is a stark illustration of the multi-pronged threat Shia civilians face.
Mhm.
They're caught between the Taliban's hardline rule and the opportunistic violence of groups like ISIS-K,
Yeah.
who see the instability as a chance to target Shia communities.
This report really drives home the constant danger these communities live under. And speaking of constant danger, let's move on to Pakistan.
Okay.
The situation in Kurram district is horrifying. Over 500,000 Shia Muslims are essentially trapped under siege by extremist groups.
The siege in Kurram isn't just a humanitarian crisis. It's a calculated strategy by these groups to isolate and terrorize Shia communities.
Right.
They've cut supply lines, attacked aid convoys,
Wow.
even shut down schools. What's happening in Kurram is a microcosm of the larger struggle for survival that Shia Muslims are facing in the region.
It's heartbreaking to imagine what those families are going through.
Yeah.
And sadly, the violence isn't confined to Kurram.
Right.
The report details 2 separate bombings in Quetta, the target and killing of Shia activist Syed Tanvir Hussein, and even a bus attack where passengers were pulled off and executed just for being Shia.
These targeted attacks, especially the bus incident, reveal a chilling level of sectarian hatred within Pakistani society. It raises serious questions about the government's commitment or even its ability to protect its Shia citizens from this kind of violence.
It makes you wonder what can be done to address this deeply embedded intolerance.
Yeah.
Now the report takes a turn and shifts our focus to Bahrain.
Okay.
I was shocked to read about the Bahraini government deporting 700 naturalized Pakistani citizens simply because they were Shia.
This mass deportation is a blatant act of state-sanctioned discrimination.
Hmm.
And it's not an isolated incident.
Right.
It fits into a pattern of systematic marginalization of the Shia majority
Yeah.
by the Sunni-led government in Bahrain.
And this pattern is also evident in the government's repeated blocking of Shia worshippers from attending Friday prayers.
Right.
It's a clear attempt to suppress their religious practice and freedom of assembly.
Precisely, these actions demonstrate how state power can be used to restrict religious freedom and silence dissent. And from state-sponsored discrimination, the report takes us to Lebanon, where the focus shifts to the actions of the Israeli military against Shia communities.
We see the demolition of homes in Rab al-Thalathan, a village in southern Lebanon, and an airstrike on Jarjua that resulted in civilian casualties.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I'm not completely clear on how this connects to the larger picture.
Well, it's important to understand these events within the context of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the complex dynamics in Lebanon. Shia communities, particularly those in the south, often find themselves caught in the crossfire,
Right.
their homes and lives vulnerable to the spillover of regional tensions.
So their location combined with the ongoing conflict puts them in a particularly vulnerable position.
Exactly.
And then we come to one of the most complex and sensitive situations in the report, Syria.
Syria is a tragic case study in the devastation that conflict and sectarianism can unleash. The civil war has created a chaotic and dangerous environment.
Right.
And Shia communities often bear the brunt of the violence, perpetrated by multiple factions vying for power.
The report details a truly horrifying array of incidents. The Sayyida Zainab shrine being stormed by armed groups, families being forcibly displaced and robbed in the Jib al-Jandali neighborhood of Homs.
It's a lot.
And the absolutely brutal murder and burning of two brothers, Manhal and Ramadan Alamat, in Hama province. It's difficult to even process.
Each of these incidents speaks to the breakdown of law and order and the sheer vulnerability of civilians, especially Shia Muslims in this conflict. The desecration of the Sayyida Zainab Shrine, a deeply revered site for Shia Muslims, adds another layer to the violence, highlighting how religion is being used to fuel and justify these acts.
It's almost beyond comprehension, the level of brutality and dehumanization.
And what makes it even more disturbing is that this violence often goes unpunished.
Right.
The lack of accountability emboldens perpetrators and creates a climate of fear where these kinds of atrocities can occur with impunity. It's a horrifying reality for Shia communities in Syria.
Reading about these cases, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by the scope of the suffering.
I know.
But the report goes on, shining a light on more targeted persecution even from the Syrian government itself.
Right.
We see authorities seizing control of al-Mustafa Mosque and dismissing Sheikh Adam al-Khatib.
These actions are a clear indication that the persecution of Shia Muslims in Syria isn't limited to extremist groups or non-state actors. The Syrian government itself is actively involved in marginalizing and repressing Shia communities.
And it's not just institutions being targeted. Individuals are at risk, too.
Yeah.
The report mentions Sheikh Issa Sharba, killed in Taznin village, and Imad Metwaj, a sanitation worker, murdered in Latakia.
Right.
These everyday people becoming victims just reinforces the pervasive sense of fear and the lack of accountability for these crimes.
These targeted killings create a chilling effect that reaches far beyond the individual victims. It sends a message to the entire Shia community. You are not safe, and no one will be held responsible for harming you.
Right.
It's a truly chilling reality to confront.
Moving on from Syria, the report takes us to Saudi Arabia, where the focus shifts to a different kind of threat. State-sanctioned executions. We learn about 6 Shia men, including businessman Saud al-Faraj, currently on death row.
What's particularly troubling about these cases, especially Saud al-Faraj's, is the lack of transparency in the Saudi judicial system. The potential for politically motivated charges and the absence of due process raise serious concerns about the fairness of these trials.
And the report doesn't let us forget about those already executed.
Right.
We learn about Ali Salman al-Laif, a prisoner of conscience according to many international human rights groups, who was executed by the Saudi government.
Ali Salman al-Laif's execution serves as a grim reminder of the Saudi government's harsh stance on dissent. It's a stark example of how the state uses its power to silence opposition, particularly from within the Shia minority, which has historically faced significant discrimination and marginalization.
It's a sobering reminder of the precarious situation for those who dare to speak out against the status quo. Finally, the report brings us to Iraq, where we encounter 2 contrasting incidents that highlight the complex realities of the country. On one hand, we have the targeted killing of a Shia security guard in Samarra.
This incident is a stark reminder that the threat of sectarian violence in Iraq, although significantly reduced, hasn't vanished entirely. It exposes the fragile security situation and the lingering challenges of reconciliation and peaceful coexistence.
And then in a jarring contrast, we have the accidental injury of 7 children in Basra.
Oh, wow.
Caused by unexploded ordnance remnants of past conflicts. It's a completely different kind of danger.
This tragic incident underscores the enduring legacy of war and the long-lasting consequences of conflict, even after the fighting has ceased. These unexploded remnants pose an ongoing threat, particularly to children who are often drawn to these dangerous objects out of curiosity or ignorance. It serves as a poignant reminder that the work of rebuilding and healing takes generations.
It's almost overwhelming, the sheer volume of incidents packed into just 1 month.
It is.
But it's crucial that we confront these realities, that we understand the breadth and depth of what Shia communities are facing around the world. As I was going through this report, I kept coming back to the role of extremist groups. It seems like they're a major catalyst for so much of the violence.
That's a really astute observation.
Yeah.
Groups like the Taliban, ISIS, and various sectarian militias are absolutely fanning the flames of hatred and intolerance.
Yeah.
They're exploiting existing tensions, twisting religious differences into weapons to justify their actions.
It's like they're preying on vulnerabilities and manipulating people's beliefs for their own agendas. And what's particularly disturbing is the way their ideology singles out Shia Muslims,
Right.
labeling them as heretics or apostates.
You've hit on a crucial point. This deliberate demonization of Shia Muslims creates a climate where violence becomes not only acceptable but almost righteous in the eyes of their followers. It's a terrifyingly effective strategy for inciting and justifying acts of brutality.
And what's even more alarming is the impunity these groups often enjoy. They commit these horrific acts, yet they rarely face any real consequences.
The lack of accountability is a major obstacle to achieving justice and lasting peace. It emboldens these groups, allowing them to operate with a sense of invincibility. Governments and international organizations need to prioritize holding these perpetrators accountable.
But that's easier said than done right. We're talking about regions with deeply entrenched political and social structures, often plagued by corruption and weak legal systems.
You're absolutely right. There are immense challenges when it comes to law enforcement and judicial processes in many of these countries.
Yeah.
But that can't be an excuse for inaction. We need to push for reforms, support human rights defenders on the ground, and demand justice for the victims.
So it's not just about condemning the violence, it's about actively working to dismantle the systems that allow it to flourish. And what about the role of the international community? What can be done on a global level to address this crisis?
The international community has a moral imperative to act. We need to see more than just words of condemnation. Targeted sanctions against those responsible for these human rights violations. Increased humanitarian aid for the affected communities.
Right.
These are tangible steps that can make a difference.
But often there's this hesitation, this reluctance to intervene in what are considered internal affairs, or to get entangled in complex geopolitical situations.
I understand that hesitation.
Right.
But we can't let concerns about sovereignty or political maneuvering overshadow the suffering of innocent people.
Yeah.
Human rights are universal. We have a collective responsibility to uphold them, regardless of national borders.
You're right. We can't just stand on the sidelines and watch as these atrocities continue. So let's bring it back to us,
Okay.
to the individual level.
Right.
What can ordinary people like us do to make a difference? It can feel so overwhelming.
It's easy to feel powerless,
Right.
but awareness is the first step. We need to educate ourselves about these issues, challenge prejudice and discrimination when we encounter it, and support organizations working on the ground to protect the rights of Shia Muslims.
We can also contact our elected officials, urge them to take concrete action, and hold them accountable for their policies.
Absolutely, and never underestimate the power of seemingly small acts of solidarity supporting Shia-owned businesses, participating in interfaith events, speaking out against injustice. These are all ways to chip away at the structures of intolerance.
I'm struck by something you said earlier about the normalization of violence and discrimination against Shia Muslims. It's so disturbing to think about it becoming just an accepted part of life in some regions.
It's a chilling thought, and that's precisely what this report is fighting against. By shining a light on these atrocities, by documenting the individual stories of suffering, it's forcing us to confront this grim reality. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to it.
That's a powerful message. This report is a wake-up call, a reminder that we can't be complacent. But you also reminded us that we're not powerless. We can choose to be agents of change. This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but it's also left me with a lot of questions. One thing I keep thinking about is the deeper context, the historical and social forces that have led to this widespread persecution of Shia Muslims. It can't just be random acts of violence.
That's a crucial point to truly understand this crisis. We need to look beyond the immediate events and delve into the historical and social forces that have created this environment of intolerance.
Okay, so let's start with the historical perspective.
Historically, Shia Muslims have often faced marginalization and discrimination within Muslim-majority societies. There are deep-seated theological and political differences that have resulted in centuries of tension and conflict.
So this division goes all the way back to the early days of Islam, right? I remember learning about the Sunni-Shia split after the Prophet Muhammad's death.
Exactly. The disagreement over the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad created this fundamental divide
Right.
that has shaped the political and religious landscape of Islam ever since.
Yeah.
And sadly, these historical divisions continue to fuel contemporary conflicts and influence social dynamics in many parts of the world.
So it's not just about ancient religious disputes.
Right.
It's about power, politics, and control
Yeah.
woven into the very fabric of these societies.
Precisely, we see these historical grievances being manipulated by political leaders and extremist groups
Yeah.
to consolidate power and further their own agendas. Countries like Bahrain, where the Sunni monarchy systematically marginalizes the Shia majority, and Saudi Arabia, where the Shia minority faces ongoing discrimination and repression, are prime examples of this.
It's like history is repeating itself, but with new players and more sophisticated methods of control. And on top of all this, we have the rise of extremist ideologies in recent decades,
Yeah.
which seem to have amplified the anti-Shia sentiment even further.
Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have weaponized sectarianism, propagating a particularly virulent and dangerous form of Islam that demonizes Shia Muslims as infidels and legitimizes violence against them. It's fueled a level of hatred that's difficult to comprehend.
And what's terrifying is how effectively they've used technology and the internet to spread their message. Their propaganda and recruitment efforts have reached a global audience, inciting violence far beyond their immediate geographical reach.
The internet has become a double-edged sword. While it can be a powerful tool for connecting people and disseminating information, it's also provided a platform for extremist groups to spread their hateful ideology and recruit followers. It's created new challenges in the fight against intolerance.
Right, so we have this complex web of historical factors, contemporary politics, and the rise of extremist ideologies all contributing to the current crisis. It's not just a religious conflict, it's a struggle for power, for identity, for control.
You've captured it perfectly. And at the heart of this struggle are millions of Shia Muslims around the world facing discrimination, violence, and persecution on a daily basis. It's a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract concepts or geopolitical chess moves. These are real lives, real families impacted by this crisis.
I'm realizing that this report isn't just about documenting incidents. It's about giving a voice to the voiceless. It's about forcing us to acknowledge the human cost of these conflicts and the urgent need for change.
You're absolutely right. Behind every statistic, every incident in this report, there's a human story, a story of lost resilience, and the enduring hope for a better future. We can't forget that.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface here of a vast and complex problem.
It is.
It's easy to get lost in the statistics and the geopolitical analysis, but you've constantly brought it back to the human element.
Yeah.
These aren't just numbers on a page.
Right.
These are real people, real families.
Absolutely.
Whose lives have been shattered by violence, discrimination, and fear.
That's a vital point to remember. Every incident in that report represents a human story, a story of loss, suffering, but also of incredible resilience. We can't let the scale of this crisis numb us to the individual experiences of those affected.
I have to admit, I started this deep dive feeling overwhelmed.
Right.
And frankly, a bit hopeless.
Right.
But you've highlighted something crucial. We're not powerless.
We're not.
We can all play a role in raising awareness, challenging prejudice, and demanding justice.
Exactly. Each one of us has a voice, and every action, no matter how small, contributes to change. Whether it's donating to organizations supporting Shia communities, educating ourselves and others about the issues, or simply speaking out against injustice, we can all be part of the solution.
I think that's a really empowering message for our listeners.
I hope so.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, sometimes disturbing, but ultimately a call to action. We can't afford to be bystanders when faced with this level of human suffering.
I completely agree the situation is urgent, but it's not hopeless. There are dedicated individuals and organizations working tirelessly to address these challenges, and they need our support by amplifying their voices, advocating for change, and holding those in power accountable. We can contribute to a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this incredibly insightful, albeit heavy deep dive.
Okay.
You've really given us a lot to think about, and more importantly, a lot to act on.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, knowledge is only truly valuable when we use it to make a difference. Let's all commit to turning awareness into action and working together to create a world where every individual, regardless of their faith, can live with dignity, security, and freedom.